You are listening to This is Oklahoma, hosted by Mike Hearn, telling stories of Oklahomans and those that have made it their home.
This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma stories through its people since 1927. Follow them online at oklahomahof.com and definitely on Instagram at oklahomahof. Let's get into today's episode. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of This is Oklahoma. Mike Hearn here, your host, back with another episode down at the Treasury in Oklahoma City today with Mr. Bill Price to talk about his book, At War with Corruption, a biography of Bill Price, U.S. Attorney of the Western District of Oklahoma, written by Michael J. Hightower. I'm sure he's a great friend of yours. If he wanted to write a book about you and spend hours and hours telling stories. And also the foreword by previous Governor Frank Keating, which, again, I assume is a very good friend of yours.
Well, Michael Hightower hadn't been a friend before this, but we developed a friendship over the course of 20 plus interviews. And I've always been a friend of Frank Keating's.
Mm-hmm. Well, amazing book, fascinating story. A lot of Oklahoma corruption stories in there, and you just kind of happen to find your way in the middle of all of them for the most part. We won't talk about all of them because we could be here for days. But for people listening, I'll put the link so they can go check out the book, buy it, and read it themselves, because it is fascinating to talk about kind of Oklahoma history and the corruption through the state and the state government and just all of that crazy stuff. But we'll take it back. I want to start with kind of your upbringing, where you grew up, your family, and we'll navigate through kind of young preschool, high school, and how we get into working and going to Georgetown as university, and then returning to Oklahoma and going to OU. So that's kind of the process that we're going to talk about today. But take me back to little Bill Price. Where was that time, and what was kind of like your, I guess, childhood dream?
Well, my grandparents came in on the run. My grandmother was 99 when she died, and used to tell me as a teenager about living in a sod house and coming in on a covered wagon in northwestern Oklahoma, a little tiny town of Oakwood that non-existent now. It's a gas station is about it. And my dad worked his way through high school, college, medical school, became chief of surgery at Mercy Hospital. And I was raised in Crown Heights and went to Edgemere grade school and then Cassidy High School. My upbringing was interesting. My parents weren't that political, but I was, and got involved in the Teenage Republicans. And two experiences that relate to the corruption of that time. One was driving G.T. Blankenship's bus around the state, just I and G.T. He ran for Attorney General and won, and his main issue was uncovering the Supreme Court scandal. It's hard to imagine a majority of the Supreme Court was taking bribes. How could you practice law in that environment? Yeah. And he was brave enough to uncover that. And much of the experiences of that time came over to me as, boy, it's important to eliminate corruption. Secondly, J.D. McCarty was Speaker of the House. And in Oklahoma, the governor is not that strong. And J.D. McCarty had destroyed governors before. He was incredibly powerful. And his power derived from special interests would bring sacks of money to JD, and he would pass it around to everybody. So everybody was dependent on their cash getting them elected. And so J.D. McCarty was in the most Democratic district in Oklahoma, southeastern Oklahoma County, and a guy named Al Snipes, who was Republican chairman. There were only about 10% of the Senate and the House or the electorate that was Republican at that time, and Al Snipes didn't even have a candidate. He had these teenage Republicans, and we had about 100 members that would call all the voters and find out if he found out that there's 2 or 3 Republicans in the whole district. And so he recruited one of them that people thought well of, a funeral home director that they saw his signs, and named Vondell Smith. And so we called every voter, and this district was so impoverished that it probably had 10% turnout, and he managed to defeat J.D. McCarty in the most Democratic district in Oklahoma. And then a couple of years later, McCarty went to jail for tax evasion from all these sacks of money. And so those were the 2 of the experiences that I was involved in. Yeah. And then I went to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, came back to OU Law School, and was involved in politics both places.
Yeah. You mentioned Oakwood. Is that why the golf course is called Oakwood Country Club in Enid, or not? Is that related?
It may be. I don't know. The only time Oakwood ever came up was in the county commissioner case. Yeah. There was a bribe on the old streets of Oakwood. Dad would drive up to northwestern Oklahoma with me, and we'd stop by Oakwood, and it was a block off of the a highway, yeah. And it looked like a ghost town. It was one street of falling down buildings. Yeah. That was Oakwood. So they may have adopted that old time name.
Yeah. And reading the book, you were very, very involved from a very young age in, kind of just young politics. And it wasn't, it's kind of like, you were the leader of a party or just kind of a group or whatever you want to call it. Like, you really wanted to move into that space, and you had leadership tendencies from a very young age too, which I noticed reading the book.
Well, back then especially, the Republican Party was so small that it was the Reform Party, in addition to being conservative, which is the norm in Oklahoma. It was the anti-corruption party to a large extent. There were some Democrats that were anti-corruption, but they were a minority, right. Whereas the Republican Party was really attractive to the youth because it changed Oklahoma's politics from good old boy corruption that they were seeing all the time.
Mm-hmm. That's something that I think, and you've probably seen this over time too, it just kind of the good old boy corruption seems to just evolve, and every generation is going to see some form of good old boys because they're just the new generation coming up, right? I'm sure you've seen that over history, and we've chatted before we were recording, like, it just seems to evolve. It's never going to stop fully, but it's just as much as we can do, even if you didn't, and all the guys who you recruited and worked along with, if you guys didn't, and you mentioned GC Blankenship, like if you guys didn't, push against it, there's no saying how bad it could be now, right? Like, of all the stuff that's happened because of that.
Well, there's some changes that occurred. It's not that the corruption has gone away, but it's not systematic like it was, systemic like it was back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even earlier. In the county commissioner case, we would run into people that would tell us that since statehood, a majority of the material didn't exist. that the county commissioners bought, and the 50% that they did buy was 10% kickbacks, which costs the county 40% more because you have to have all these layers of middlemen. And so it had a dramatic effect, and it still has a dramatic effect on the transportation, the bridges, the roads throughout the state of Oklahoma. People don't realize that in rural Oklahoma, there might be 400 or 500 of these wooden bridges.
Yeah.
And if they, non-existent lumber was the norm.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and a lot of things, especially with history, people now of, I guess I would say my generation or anyone younger, just grow up, they're very unaware of this stuff, and they would have no idea. And because of your book and others, like, they can go back, and I know you've done a previous podcast with the Oklahoma History Center with Trey and Dr. Blackburn, and I'll link that in the description for everyone listening to go listen to that, because it's fascinating. You dive a lot into the history of that stuff.
And it wasn't just Oklahoma. If you read Claro's book about Lyndon Johnson's or Bobby Baker's book, the same sacks of cash were occurring in the Congress at the same time that J.D. McCarty and others were getting huge amounts of cash from special interest groups. And the county commissioner case is really nationwide. We, the FBI and myself, went lecturing to assistant U.S. attorneys and FBI agents, and there were prosecutions throughout the South. I don't think they eliminated it like we did.
Right.
They didn't have a lot of the breaks or real good investigators. But like in Mississippi, 85 people were prosecuted.
Yeah.
In a lot of these states, 10 or so. The only states that avoided this were the ones that had a county manager system of government. And that's the reason why I've always pushed for home rule, which is allowing the county to choose their system of county government.
Gotcha.
We allow that in cities and towns, but we don't allow it for counties. You've got one system, and the system tends to be wasteful and lends itself without checks and balances to corruption. And that's not to say that the people that are currently in those offices aren't honest as can be, but it's not the best structure.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't seem to make sense. Right?
No.
But before we dive into kind of the county commissioner stuff, I want you to go back and kind of talk to me a little bit about where the feeling for, doing the right thing, and, where does that come from for you? Was there a certain example? Was there where does that start? Because to mount not an attack, but to mount like an opposition against the good old boys of Oklahoma and the corruption and the way it was going.
Corruption not only costs a bunch of money to the taxpayers and hurts the little guy even worse than the more wealthy people in the community, but it also erodes the whole system of democracy. And I would see it when I'd campaign for somebody for state legislature, and especially in people that came from rural Oklahoma. A lot of times they'd say, I'm not voting for anybody, they're all crooks. And they were right.
Yeah.
That really erodes democracy. That destroys America. And part of that passion came from that, a realization that our democracy was under attack. Also, too, commercial bribery, which I wrote the statute on commercial bribery in Oklahoma, erodes our system of free enterprise. And you want to have as free a markets as possible without people bribing other people to change those markets around.
Yeah.
And so that passion came from just the output of seeing what was happening in Oklahoma, but also of personal experiences with voters.
Yeah. Where does the kind of just, your passion and I guess why did you take kind of the conservative route, against, I guess, the liberal route?
Well, probably Oklahoma is got a very conservative roots. We believe in small government. We believe in government closer to the people. I read a lot of Hyatt and Friedman, conservative intellectuals, and later Thomas Sewell. That is the basis of my conservative thought, is that free markets tend to work.
Yeah.
And the more layers the government's put on it, the less free markets work and the less jobs and opportunities are available for people.
I guess we're starting to see that now, right?
Oh, absolutely.
People aren't happy with it.
Absolutely.
Especially not in Oklahoma, they're not. Unless you're in oil and gas, I guess the oil.
Yeah,
the
way to solve climate change is not through restricting oil and gas. It's through innovation, R&D, nuclear, things like that can make a difference. But just restricting the oil and gas industry is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. It's again, we could speak for hours about what's going on in the world and whoever's sat in the right chairs and all of that stuff. But one thing that kind of fascinated me when reading the book is your time in Georgetown and the people you meet there, and kind of like the speaking opportunities you had and the way that you led through that, and obviously you met your wife there as well. But talk to me a little bit about kind of why you wanted to go to Georgetown and then your time there as well.
Well, I went to Georgetown in large measure because it was I love politics, and it was D.C. in the epicenter of political thought. And every night you'd have a choice of going and hearing the head of state or a debate between the two leading economists or going to an embassy party. That education right in of itself was great. It was pretty well divided at the time. It's not the uniformity of left-wing thought like we think of now. It was about half Republican and half Democrat, and everybody was very political. And I was on the student council with Bill Clinton, for instance, and my roommate throughout college was president of the class the first year, and he was an ardent Robert Kennedy fan. In fact, he spent his honeymoon at the Kennedy compound. They let him do that, and he didn't like Bill Clinton and thought he was a phony. Anyway, our class went against Clinton for student body president, and it was overwhelming, and that's the reason why he lost. And I have a ton of Bill Clinton stories. I got along all right with him, but I kind of would view his remarks with a grain of salt. Later on, his campaign manager in our class, who just loved him, was a guy named Paul Prosperi. And the later time I see Paul Prosperi's list on the pardon list for Clinton. He was attorney in Florida, had the first big fundraiser for Clinton for running for president, contributed hundreds of thousands of dollars to Clinton causes, and had embezzled $1.6 million from his clients. And he got convicted by a federal jury, and he got his conviction affirmed, and then Clinton pardoned him. And so the press never picked up on this, but that's not a case where you got fooled by your advisors. He knew this guy really well, and there's no reason to reduce his sentence.
Right. Yeah. All of that kind of stuff that you hear about this stuff all the time, and that's a perfect example of it. It's kind of smoke and mirrors, and it's like everyone's watching over here, but we're going to slip this one over here and clear everything out. It's politics, right? That's just the only way to say it. And
well, it shouldn't be politics.
It shouldn't be, but sadly it is.
Sadly, there are people that are in politics that are willing to sell their soul to, and it really hurts the public substantially. There's a large measure of politicians today that I think are fundamentally honest, and that's the problem with corruption, is that we prosecuted 230 county commissioners, and virtually there's only about 10 that we would verify were honest. Yeah. And that's out of 3 times 77 counties. And what happens is when you don't prosecute, there's always going to be 10 or 15% that are corrupt, but you begin to have the middle ground of people deciding they're suckers and everybody else is doing it and not getting prosecuted, and pretty soon the whole group becomes corrupt.
Right. Yeah, because people are just kind of following the example. They think, well, this is how we've always done it. We're just going to join and be a part of it, and then they realize that that's clearly not how it should be done.
And this is in a milieu in which there had been headlines for 2 years about the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office conducting this investigation, and they still were doing
They knew
it.
It was coming.
It's incredible. When our case bled down to Texas, they hadn't had this publicity, and it was even more corrupt. So it's a national problem. It's not just a local problem. It is still the largest political corruption case in American history, and it was large measure due to the really skilled investigators, FBI and IRS Criminal Division. That we worked on a daily basis for 3 years conducting this investigation.
It's sadly money does things to people that you'd never say that they would ever do that, right? You'd say there's no way this person, I know this person, they're a great person, but somebody else shakes a bag of cash in front of them and their morals are changed, and that's kind of ruins. Once they turned once, it's hard for them to stop going down that path.
Well, when people tried to justify it, I'd ask a number of questions. Did you ever do this in front of somebody? No. Did you ever tell your wife? No. Did you ever put it down on your taxes? No. That tells you a lot about how criminal they thought it was. We included in every indictment the oath of office of a county commissioner, which basically just says 10 different ways I won't take money. So they were violating their oath of office.
Right. Because is there a certain, and forgive me for not knowing this, but is there a certain number that they are allowed to take up to a certain, no? Is there any way in like the city or not?
Obviously, going to lunch with people and things like that are not corrupt. They don't buy votes. But taking money, period.
I had one of my professors in school. He used to be, I think, mayor of of a local city here, and he was telling us stories that he would go to lunch with his kind of group, and a guy would just meet him in the bathroom and just get offer him a wad of cash or an envelope, and he's like, I don't want it. I can't take it. Leave me alone. Stop following me into the bathroom with wads of cash. But that was 6-7 years ago, which is scary. I'm sure it still happens today, sadly. And I think it's probably easier with the way that technology moves money now. There's ways to get around it, sadly, and the numbers are significantly more.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the general salaries of politicians, and then you look at their net worth, it's like, how does that happen?
Well, and knowing something's happening and proving it is a different thing.
Yeah.
In Stevens County, for instance, they had spent enough money on bridges to rebuild every bridge in the county 3 times. So they knew it was non-assistant materials, but they couldn't prove which particular ones.
Yeah.
And only through having a grand jury system and going after the tax part of the people, which was maybe in a different county, could you get at the bottom of this?
Yeah. How did you figure out, I guess, what was like the first kind of domino to fall that you figured out that, hey, there's something going on, something going on here, and then it leads to you figuring out that everyone's...
Well, Stevens County, a homeowner had gotten fed up with their lousy roads and bridges and had started a county grand jury. And we found out later on they would brag about for 40 years they had gone to county grand juries and all lied and skated. And so that wasn't of concern to them. And they had done the same thing here. The weakness is that if you're a county commissioner and I'm a supplier and we do a non-assistant material deal for $10,000 worth of lumber that doesn't exist, I get a check from the county for $10,000 and I give you $5,000 in cash. Right. My problem is I pay taxes on total $10,000 unless I have what's called a phony backup invoice supplier, which makes it look like I bought the lumber or whatever it is from them for 90% of the cost. Then I get a deduction for cost of goods sold, and I only have pay taxes on the 10% disposal profit.
Yeah.
The weakness of this system is that phony backup invoice supplier is in deep trouble tax-wise. And that was not in Stevens County. That was Dorothy Griffin is one of them that was in the other part of the state. And confronting her with her tax returns and with her phony invoices was enough to change her into a government witness, and she did a whole bunch of tapes of suppliers that helped prove tax, and then we picked out the right supplier, luckily, out of the 13 only one. We did a psychological analysis for weeks to figure out which supplier to approach, because if we did the wrong one, we were dead. And all the rest told us to pound sand. Luckily, we turned one supplier, and he went and did his business with a whole bunch of commissioners, and that caused the avalanche of pleas.
Right, and then you open the spider web and you realize how far this goes out.
Yeah, I really didn't believe that the scope of this and how prevalent it was, but the more I got into it, the more incredible it was. And that's just one of 20 cases that I was doing at this time. I was involved in as third or fourth chair in David Hall, who was governor of Oklahoma. The Corporation Commission scandal came from a conversation with Bob Anthony, in which we knew what was going on, but we didn't have a witness to testify against the attorney that was bribing everybody. And again, this has a real impact on people. Your utility bills for somebody on Social Security goes way up because somebody got bribed in the Corporation Commission.
Yeah. God, and that person who's getting bribed, they have no idea. They don't see that, right? They don't even care, obviously, that this is happening.
A large part of politics is what I call the seen and unseen. There may be a limited number of people that benefit. A good example is the sugar lobby. The sugar lobby may benefit from subsidies, and that's seen and a small group of people. But everybody pays a little bit more as a result. And so it is much easier for politicians that don't have a backbone to accommodate the seen and ignore the unseen.
Yeah. But, I mean, just to put it into context for people listening, how much money do you think was, I mean, to put it in like a monetary term, how much do you think was cost the state then, and all, including all of these 20 cases you cried and everything else?
Oh, it's got to be in the billions.
Yeah.
It was occurring in the oil field too. You would have when deep gas was deregulated. The cost of a well went from $500,000 to $10 million, and the main office wouldn't have any idea what the well should cost. And so if a supplier approached somebody and said, let's do $10,000 worth of oil field mud, and but you really needs $10,000, and we split it 50-50. It was the same scheme, and we had people that oil field companies that had $1 million budget for prostitutes, $1 million for cocaine, and $10 million for kickbacks. So, if you add these two together, it's definitely in the billions. The Corporation Commission had a huge effect on hundreds of millions of dollars. David Hall alone, it wasn't just the case he was prosecuted on, it was also the bags of cash that all the builders had to bring to David Hall in order to get buildings constructed. It's hard to gauge what cost it is, but it's got to be enormous.
And we're still dealing with some of the effects of this today. Right.
Oh, absolutely. The roads and bridges, if they were inferior for since statehood, they continue to be challenged. The Corporation Commission, much of those price hikes are still in effect. The buildings that the state built under David Hall are still inflated cost. So it has an effect even today. And that's not to say that there's not some corruption going on, but it's not endemic like it was.
Right, yeah. Moving forward, because I want to be kind of conscious of time to tell as many stories as we can. Talk to me about kind of your love for education. Because that's another battle that you've tackled and continue to tackle because of the boards that you're on to this day. Where does that love of education come from, and why do you want to be such a big part in education in Oklahoma?
Well, everything derives from education. The whole future of the country depends on it. I've been for 12 years or whatever part of OCPA, the head of the School Choice Coalition, and I've come to the conclusion that the only way to really change the education environment is to have competition. Even if it's 10% of the competition, it makes a difference in terms of change. In every aspect of business, an outside competitor is what changes organizations. for the better. And so I became an ardent supporter of school choice. Charter schools, money for private schools. I was one of the founders of Cristo Rey, which is a great school for underprivileged kids. And would really benefit from school choice. I've been head of the School Choice Coalition, and also was on the state school board for 8 years. And that passion from education, my dad and mother both were real restrictive on spending money on cars or things like that, but the sky was the limit on education.
Yes.
And he really believed that education was the key to everything, and I believe that too.
No, I totally agree with you. And the sad thing is, if you look at how Oklahoma ranks in the United States of education, we're still not where we should be. And all the teachers, I saw an ad the other day, it was like there's a billboard that people in Texas are buying billboards in Oklahoma City and enticing teachers to go to Texas. Like, this is still happening, sadly.
Well, Florida, it leads the country in school choice, and they went from the bottom of the barrel to at least the mid part of the barrel. And that's the only state that has had tremendous progress in education. Some of the same states that are at the bottom of the barrel, like Mississippi, are still there.
Yeah.
And at the top of the barrel, like Massachusetts, that have a really educated public and lots of universities, are still at the top. But I look for what policies will make it so that it improves dramatically.
Yeah.
And the school choice is really the only driver that I've seen that really dramatically improves education.
Yeah. One of the other things that I noticed from the book is that you made a run for governor, and you quoted there's a quote in the book that said you're the best governor Oklahoma never had.
I didn't say that.
I know you didn't say that, but it's in the book for sure. During that time, why did you decide to make a decision to run? And then following that up, what do you think would have happened if life would have turned the other way and you would have been one of the Oklahoma governors?
Well, I'd spent 15 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office. I thought I had done most of what I could do, and the governor's race was attractive to me that year because Bellman was retiring. I didn't realize the headwinds. Bush's popularity, this is the older Bush, would turn from 80% Oklahoma to 20% when he changed his mind on taxes. And Bellman at that time, fairly or unfairly, wasn't that popular. And so I won the Republican nomination against awfully good candidates, Burns Hargis and Vince Orza. But I was facing huge headwinds in the general election. What I would have liked to have done is really improve education in Oklahoma. And improve the business climate at the time to try to get right to work, to try to get, which we eventually did do, try to get workers' comp at a reasonable level. We were really high, and make it business friendly, lower some taxes to make it so that we weren't shrinking as a state, but rather prospering.
Right. Yeah, and I'm sure just the history and the life that you spent in this space, I'm sure there's things that you see, today in the modern kind of whatever our current governor's doing or modern political climate that sometimes makes you happy and sometimes just makes you want to throw your coffee against the wall, right?
Bureaucracies have a way of just growing and taking up everything. And so the worry is that hopefully I would have been able to at least either stop it or slow it down.
Right. Yeah. Finishing up, tell us a little bit about, obviously, you met Mary at Georgetown. You brought Mary to Norman. I'm sure that experience was really tough and funny for her. She's moving to the country out of DC, and then obviously, your wonderful family and grandkids that you have today. Do you have any funny stories about bringing Mary to Norman?
Well, she had never been to Oklahoma, and she was third generation Washingtonian. Her father had been an oral surgeon there in Washington, and at the time, Norman was really a pretty small town and not linked very well to Oklahoma City by the interstate. So it was a little bit of a culture shock that the best shopping was Target, but she adjusted quickly, and she loves Oklahoma. And so when we go back, we don't look fondly on District of Columbia. It'd be a horrible place to raise a family. This was a wonderful place to raise a family. We had 3 kids. Our oldest is an attorney at UNLV. Our son, James, has a business here. Our Eileen is a nurse. And they have wonderful grandkids, which we see all the time. So it's a wonderful life.
Yeah. That's amazing. And looking back, obviously we chatted before and the things that you're currently still doing, even though you are, quote, retired, you're very involved on the boards, working with your family. And, I don't see you slowing down anytime soon. No,
it's not in my nature. I'm on nonprofit boards, Cristo Rey, the School Choice Coalition, Shiloh, which is a wonderful camp for underprivileged kids, primarily in the minority community. Yeah. Again, it's changing youth, inspiring them at a young age, that I think is the key to changing around as society.
I totally agree with you. And back to education, it starts with education, doesn't it? So
absolutely.
Keep kids in education and teach them the right things, and then let them to be, lead them, give them the opportunity to go do what they want, follow their dreams.
The same opportunity my dad had, going from a sod house to chief of surgery. It was just a lot of hard work and the freedom to do it.
Definitely. Well, Mr. Price, thank you so much for taking some time out to come down and talk to me about this book. Thanks to the Treasury for hosting us today. For people listening, I'll put the link to the book in the description. You can go read it. It's a fascinating read. At War with Corruption. So thank you so much.
Michael Hightower did a spectacular job, not just outlining my life, but really it's a history book of 3 or 4 decades of Oklahoma that is a must-read for people.
I totally agree. It's fascinating stuff, and I can't wait to, like I said to you before, I can't wait to finish it, because I don't like to do all of the research because it doesn't make the podcast as interesting, because I know all the answers to the questions. But I can't wait to kind of dive into it thoroughly and finish it off. But for what I have read, it was fascinating. And like you said, Oklahoma history, it's filled in here, and some things are going to make you mad, some things are going to make you really happy when you read this.
Also, for future prosecutors, it tells all the different investigative techniques and everything to discern whether any corruption comes back in a different area and how to attack it.
Yeah, it's awesome. And I really appreciate you and everything you've done for the state. I think I'll speak on behalf of people listening for that, because there's a lot of things that have changed because of the fight that you put towards corruption. A lot of people probably didn't appreciate that at the time, and you went up against some people, and I'm sure there were times where you would offer bags of cash, and for you to turn that down and say no and fight against it tells a lot about you. So thank you so much for taking time out to come down. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.
For people listening, I'll put the link in the description for the book. You guys can go check it out, and we will catch you next episode. Cheers. This podcast is presented by the Oklahoma Hall of Fame, telling Oklahoma stories through its people since 1927. Follow them online at oklahomahof.com and definitely on Instagram at oklahomahof.
Thank you for listening. We are inspired by those around us and hope that you are too. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform and leave us a review so we can keep telling your stories. For more great Oklahoma content, follow This is Oklahoma on Facebook and Instagram.